That glass did not come from any cup in this castle. Emily Carter spoke so quietly that the kitchen noise nearly swallowed the words. Steam rolled from copper pots. Knives struck wooden boards in quick, practiced rhythms. Somewhere near the ovens, the head cook shouted at a boy for burning the honey glaze. No one paid attention to the waitress standing beside the serving table with a silver tray balanced against her hip. That was normal. Emily had worked in Blackwood Keep long enough to understand that being unnoticed was not an insult. It was protection. Invisible girls were rarely questioned. They were rarely praised, but they were also rarely remembered when powerful people needed someone to blame. She lowered the tray beneath the nearest candle. Between 12 crystal goblets lay a piece of blue glass. It was no larger than her thumbnail, curved slightly at one edge and painted with a thin line of silver. The fragment caught the flame and threw a cold blue mark across her fingers. Emily checked every goblet. None was chipped. She checked the bottles, the decanters, even the small glass bowls filled with salt and crushed herbs. Everything was whole. Throw it away. Mrs. Hawthorne, the banquet steward, appeared beside her without warning. She was a narrow woman dressed in severe brown wool, with keys hanging from her belt and an expression that suggested every servant had disappointed her personally. Emily held up the fragment. It may have fallen from somewhere above. It is glass. It is painted. Mrs. Hawthorne did not look at it. And you are late. Emily closed her fingers around the shard. Servants were not paid to wonder. They carried, poured, cleared, bowed, and disappeared. Questions belonged to guards, councilmen, and men whose names were carved into stone. Still, she slipped the fragment into her apron pocket instead of throwing it away. The great hall waited beyond 2 oak doors. When Emily entered, warmth pressed against her face. Hundreds of candles burned beneath the vaulted ceiling, filling the air with wax, pine smoke, roasted meat, and dark wine. Black and silver banners hung between pillars. At the far end stood the raised royal table, prepared for Alpha King Alexander Blackwood and his only son. Emily kept her eyes lowered as she moved between the tables. Quiet steps. Straight tray. Never block a nobleman's path. She had learned to read a room without appearing to look at it. A chair pulled back too quickly. A hand reaching for an empty cup. A cloak about to catch on a candle stand. Small dangers were part of serving. Prevent them silently, and no one noticed. Fail once, and everyone remembered. A draft touched the back of her neck. Emily stopped. The doors were closed. The windows were sealed against the winter wind. Another breath of cold air descended from above. She raised her eyes. High over the royal table, the great stained glass crest of House Blackwood glowed in the candlelight. A silver wolf beneath a crown, surrounded by fields of deep blue glass. Emily's hand moved to her apron pocket. The fragment beneath her fingers was the same blue. Then she saw it. Directly above the chair prepared for the young heir, one small piece was missing from the window, and around the empty space, a hair-thin crack was beginning to spread. The hall changed before the doors opened. Emily felt it in the silence first. Not complete silence. The musicians were still playing near the eastern wall, bows moving over strings in a slow winter melody. Nobles continued speaking in low voices. Servants still crossed between tables with bread, wine, and steaming platters. But the room tightened. Chairs stopped scraping. Laughter softened. Guards near the pillars straightened at the same moment, as though a single invisible hand had pulled their spines upright. Then the oak doors opened. Alpha King Alexander Blackwood entered with his son beside him. Emily had seen the king before, but only from a distance. A dark figure crossing a courtyard. A broad silhouette above rows of kneeling soldiers. A face stamped onto silver coins that servants rarely held long enough to study. Up close, he seemed larger than those images had allowed. He was tall enough that the fur at his shoulders nearly brushed the carved archway. Black leather crossed a powerful chest beneath a charcoal tunic, and a heavy wolfskin cloak fell from silver clasps at his throat. His dark hair had been pushed back from a face made of hard lines, controlled strength, and the quiet certainty of a man who had never needed to demand space. Space came to him. People stepped aside before he reached them. His son walked half a pace behind. Lucas Blackwood was 8 years old, small beside his father, but carrying himself with the careful stiffness of someone who knew hundreds of eyes were measuring him. His dark formal coat was embroidered with silver thread. His hair had been combed neatly, though one stubborn lock had already fallen across his forehead. He looked neither proud nor excited. He looked trapped. Emily lowered her gaze and moved toward the royal table with a bowl of winter broth balanced on her tray. Lady Victoria Ashford reached Lucas first. She wore deep crimson velvet and pearls at her throat. Her smile was soft, practiced, and visible from across the hall. "For our young heir," she said, lifting a silver spoon toward him. Lucas turned his face away. Victoria's smile tightened. "Do not be rude." The boy's hand struck the spoon. It hit the table and rang sharply against the silver plates. Several nobles looked over. Lucas froze. Alexander's eyes shifted toward his son, unreadable. Emily reached the table before anyone could speak. She saw the bowl Victoria had placed in front of Lucas. Polished silver, wide rim, cold enough that beads of condensation had formed along the edge. Without drawing attention, Emily removed it. She replaced it with a smaller wooden bowl from her tray, one that still held the warmth of the kitchen. Then she placed a piece of honey bread beside it. Not close enough to force him to take it, only close enough for him to choose. Lucas looked at the bread, then at Emily. "You don't have to eat it," she said softly, "but it is warmer than the spoon." The boy watched her for a long moment. Then he took the bread. Across the table, Alexander noticed. Emily felt his gaze before she dared look toward him. It was not gratitude. Not yet. It was assessment. The attention of a powerful man trying to understand why his son had accepted comfort from a waitress when he had rejected everyone else. Emily stepped back. Lucas tore off a small piece of bread. Then his eyes moved past her shoulder and lifted toward the stained glass crest above the royal table. His chewing stopped. "Why is that man cutting the rope?" he whispered. Emily turned. The upper balcony was empty, but behind the dark curtain, something moved. Emily did not run. Running would have drawn every eye in the hall, and eyes were dangerous when a servant had no proof. Instead, she lifted her empty tray, turned toward the western archway, and walked with the measured pace expected of someone carrying nothing more important than dirty silver. Her heart did not match her steps. It struck hard beneath her ribs. The upper balcony could be reached through a narrow service stair behind the musicians' gallery. Emily knew the route because waitresses used it during winter feasts to refill candle oil without crossing the main floor. Nobles rarely noticed those passages. Guards noticed them even less. She reached the archway. A man stepped into her path. Beta Daniel Cross wore black leather beneath a dark green cloak, the colors of the king's inner guard. He was broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, and calm in the way men became calm when they expected obedience. "You are leaving your station?" he said. Emily lowered her eyes. The king's son saw someone on the balcony. Daniel did not look up. What did he see? A man cutting a rope. For the first time, something changed in Daniel's face. Not surprise. Calculation. It passed quickly. There is no rope above the royal table. There is a curtain line behind the stained glass. I know the hall. Emily's fingers tightened around the tray. Then you know the western stair reaches it. Daniel studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. "Show me." The stairwell was cold and narrow. Their footsteps echoed against stone as they climbed. Daniel moved behind her, close enough that Emily could feel his presence at her back. At the top, the balcony appeared empty. The dark curtain hung still. No man, no blade, no rope being cut. Daniel walked to the railing and looked down at the feast below. From there, Lucas seemed very small beneath the great window. "You frightened the air over a shadow," he said. Emily moved toward the curtain. The iron lock on the service door had been polished. Not cleaned, polished. The surrounding metal was dull with age, but the lock shone as if someone had rubbed away every trace of touch. She crouched. A fresh scrape marked the lower hinge. Beside it, a pin had been pulled halfway from the stone bracket holding the glass frame. Emily touched the railing. Oil darkened her fingertip. "There," she whispered. A thread of black fabric was caught inside the cracked stone. She reached for it. Daniel's hand closed around her wrist. His grip was not painful. It did not need to be. He removed the thread himself, carried it to the nearest candle, and held it over the flame. The fabric curled, blackened, disappeared. Emily stared at him. Daniel watched the ash fall. "You saw nothing," he said. Below them, applause rose through the hall. Emily turned toward the railing. Lady Victoria stood beside the royal table, one hand resting lightly on Lucas's shoulder. She was guiding him away from his chair, directly beneath the cracked glass. "Get the prince away from the window." Emily's voice tore through the hall before she reached the bottom of the stair. The music stopped. Every face turned toward her. That was the first punishment. Servants were not supposed to shout. They were not supposed to run through royal gatherings with their skirts gathered in one hand and terror exposed on their faces. They were certainly not supposed to interrupt Lady Victoria Ashford while she presented the heir before 5 assembled packs. Emily did all 3. Lucas stood beneath the stained glass crest, holding the ceremonial silver wolf Victoria had placed in his hands. Above him, the crack had widened. A thin white line now split the blue glass from corner to corner. Emily pushed through the western archway. 2 guards moved immediately. One caught her arm. The other stepped in front of her. "Release me," she said. The first guard tightened his grip. "Beta Cross ordered that you remain away from the royal family." Emily looked toward the balcony. Daniel had not followed her down. He was still above them, half hidden behind the curtain, one hand resting near the stone bracket. Then she saw the rope. It ran through a narrow iron ring behind the glass frame, dark against the wall, almost invisible in the candlelight. Daniel's fingers closed around it. "Lucas!" Emily shouted. The boy turned. Lady Victoria's hand remained on his shoulder. Alexander rose from his chair. The movement was small, but the entire high table reacted to it. Chairs scraped. Guards reached for weapons. Conversations died without anyone commanding them to stop. Emily pulled against the man holding her. "The window is falling." The guard hesitated. Only for a heartbeat. It was enough for Daniel to pull. Emily heard the sound before anyone else understood it. A sharp metallic snap. Not glass. The final iron pin leaving stone. The stained glass crest tilted forward. The silver wolf above the throne seemed to bow. Then the frame broke free. Emily twisted out of the guard's grasp. Pain burned across her wrist, but she was already moving. A chair struck her hip. A tray crashed beneath her foot. Someone shouted for the king. None of it mattered. Lucas looked up. For one terrible second, he did not run. He stood frozen beneath the falling window, still clutching the silver wolf to his chest. Emily crossed the last few feet and threw herself at him. Her shoulder struck his ribs. They hit the stone floor together. She pulled him beneath her, one arm around his head, the other covering the back of his neck. The glass came down. The sound was enormous. A violent explosion of color, iron, and light. Something struck Emily between the shoulders. Then another. Then too many to count. Blue and red fragments burst across the floor. Candlelight flashed through them as they fell, beautiful for the single instant before they cut into flesh. Emily's breath vanished. Her body went rigid over the boy. The hall became silent. Not quiet. Silent. One last piece of glass struck the stone beside her hand and spun slowly to a stop. Beneath Emily, Lucas was breathing. Fast. Frightened. Alive. Warm blood spread across the back of her gray dress and soaked into the white fabric of her apron. "Emily!" Lucas's voice trembled beneath her. She tried to answer, but the room had begun to tilt. Boots thundered toward them. Alexander reached the wreckage and dropped to one knee. His hands hovered above Emily's back, unable to touch her without driving the glass deeper. His face had changed. The control was gone. What remained was something colder than rage. Emily forced her eyes open. "Your son," she whispered. "Is he hurt?" Alexander looked beneath her. No. Relief passed through her like warmth. Then it was enough. Her vision darkened. As consciousness slipped away, Emily felt someone kneel beside her. Not the king. A careful hand entered her apron pocket. Fingers closed around the blue fragment. And took it. Emily woke to the smell of boiled linen and crushed pine. For several seconds, she did not know where she was. Then she tried to move. Pain opened across her back like fire. Her breath caught. The room sharpened around her. Stone walls, a low hearth, shelves lined with brown bottles, and candlelight trembling against a basin stained pink with diluted blood. She was lying face down on a narrow healer's bed. Bandages wrapped her shoulders and ribs. Every breath pulled against the stitches. "Do not move." The voice came from the darkest corner. Alpha King Alexander Blackwood sat beside the closed door. He had removed his cloak, but not the blood from his hands. Dark red marked his fingers and the cuffs of his black tunic. He looked as though he had been sitting there for hours without changing position. Emily swallowed. "Lucas! Alive!" The answer came immediately. Unhurt. A cut on his palm. Nothing more. Only then did Emily allow her eyes to close. Alexander watched the relief pass over her face. You nearly died. He did not. That was not my question. Emily opened her eyes again. The king leaned forward and placed something on the table beside her. A small knife. Its narrow blade caught the candlelight. The handle was wrapped in worn brown leather, the kind used by kitchen servants to cut twine, bread, and cloth. Emily stared at it. I have never seen that before. It was found beneath my son. The room seemed to grow colder. Alexander's voice remained controlled, but control was not the same as calm. Beta Cross says you ran toward Lucas carrying it. I carried nothing. He says you knew where the glass would fall. I did. Before my guards did. Yes. His eyes hardened. Did you save my son, Emily Carter, or were you trying to reach him? The accusation should have frightened her. Instead, something inside her became very still. She had crossed the hall while everyone watched. She had taken the glass meant for his child. Her blood was still on his hands. And yet power had done what power always did. It looked downward for someone easy to blame. Emily did not beg. She did not cry. She turned her face toward him as far as the pain allowed. Where is the blue glass? Alexander's expression changed slightly. What glass? The piece in my apron pocket. There was no glass in your pocket. There was. She told him about the fragment on her tray. The missing section in the royal window. The polished lock. The oil on the railing. The black thread Daniel had burned. Alexander listened without interruption. When she finished, the silence held for 3 long breaths. Then the door opened. Lucas slipped inside before the guard could stop him. His face was pale. His formal coat had been replaced with a plain wool shirt, and one hand was wrapped in white cloth. He crossed the room and stood beside Emily's bed. She is telling the truth, he said. Alexander turned. Lucas looked at his father, then at the knife. After the glass fell, everyone was looking at her. His small voice shook, but he continued. Everyone except Beta Cross. The king went completely still. Lucas pointed toward Emily's apron, folded on a chair near the hearth. He knelt beside her. He put his hand in her pocket. Outside, heavy footsteps approached the door. Then Daniel Cross spoke from the corridor. My king, we need to move the prince to the Eastern Tower. Tonight. The Eastern Tower was not safe. Emily knew it before Daniel finished speaking. Not because of his voice. It was steady, respectful, shaped perfectly around the concern expected from a loyal beta. Because of the coal. 3 mornings earlier, Emily had watched kitchen boys carry 6 black sacks across the lower courtyard toward the eastern wing. She remembered because the weather had been unusually mild, and Mrs. Hawthorne had complained that someone was wasting winter stores. The tower had not been occupied in months. It did not need 6 sacks of coal. Alexander opened the door. Daniel stood in the corridor with 4 guards behind him. The western rooms cannot be secured, Daniel said. The attacker had access to the royal hall. We should move Prince Lucas somewhere isolated. To the eastern tower, Alexander said. Yes, my king. Emily pushed against the bed. Pain tore across her back. The healer rushed forward. You will open every wound. The tower, Emily said. Alexander turned. Her arms trembled beneath her weight, but she forced herself higher. The doors locked from the outside. Daniel looked at her as though noticing a stain on the wall. She is feverish. Emily ignored him. The hearth connects to an old ventilation shaft. It runs beneath the kitchens and into the coal room. Alexander's gaze sharpened. How do you know? Waitresses used the lower passage during winter feasts. Before the northern stair was repaired, Daniel stepped into the room. My king, every moment we remain here places your son at risk. No, Emily whispered. Moving him does. Silence gathered. Then a bell rang somewhere below. Once, twice, 3 times. An alarm. One of Daniel's guards entered hurriedly. Fire in the western corridor. Daniel did not look surprised. The prince must be moved now. Alexander glanced toward Lucas. That single hesitation was enough. 2 guards seized the boy. Lucas shouted. Alexander moved, but Daniel drew his blade. Everything happened quickly after that. Steel left sheaths. The healer screamed. 1 candle struck the floor and went out. Daniel backed into the corridor while his men dragged Lucas away. Do not follow, he warned. Not unless you want your son returned in pieces. Then they were gone. Alexander stood motionless for half a breath. The room changed around him. Not with a roar. With the disappearance of restraint. He reached for his sword. Emily caught his wrist. The movement pulled at her stitches, and warm blood spread beneath the bandages. "The main stairs are a trap," she said. "My son is in that tower, and Daniel expects you to break through the front." Alexander looked down at her hand. "You cannot stand." "I do not need to stand to remember." She told him what the servants knew. The eastern tower doors were reinforced oak. Striking them could collapse the damaged chimney. If coal had been burned without opening the upper vent, the room would already be filling with smoke. There was another way inside. A narrow wine passage beneath the old pantry. Too small for armored guards. Large enough for a waitress. Alexander stared at her. "You are bleeding." "Lucas is breathing it." That ended the argument. He lifted her from the bed before the healer could object. Emily bit down on a cry as the wounds across her back reopened. Alexander carried her through the servant corridor while smoke began curling beneath the stones. At the pantry door, Emily pointed toward a row of empty barrels. Behind the third one. He moved it aside. A black opening waited in the wall. From somewhere deep inside the passage came the faint sound of a child coughing. The passage was narrower than Emily remembered. Alexander had to turn sideways to enter, one shoulder scraping the stone. He carried no torch. Fire would consume the little clean air left between the walls. Instead, he followed the sound of Lucas coughing. Emily moved behind him on shaking legs, one hand pressed against the wall, the other held tight across her ribs. Every step pulled at the wounds beneath her bandages. Warm blood had begun to run down her side again. Alexander looked back once. "Stay here." No, it was the first time she had spoken to him without lowering her eyes. He did not argue again. The passage sloped beneath the kitchens, where the smell of ash and old wine mixed with something sharper. Smoke. It crept toward them in thin gray ribbons. Emily touched the wall as they moved. She counted the stones beneath her fingers. 7, 8, 9. At the 10th, she stopped. There, a rusted iron grate blocked a narrow opening above them. Beyond it, someone dragged a heavy object across the floor. Alexander placed both hands against the bars. "Stand back." He pulled. The metal groaned, but held. Emily saw the mortar around the lower hinge. Dark, damp, weaker than the stone above it. "The bottom," she whispered. "Not the center." Alexander shifted his grip and tore the grate free. They entered the coal room. Heat struck them immediately. The furnace door stood open. Black smoke rolled through the ceiling vent instead of rising, forced backward by a sheet of iron someone had nailed across the upper shaft. Lucas lay near the far wall. His hands were bound. His face was pale beneath a layer of soot. Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides. A masked figure stepped from behind the furnace and swung a blade toward his back. Emily saw the movement first. "Behind you." Alexander turned. Steel met steel. The sound cracked through the room. The attacker moved quickly, dressed in servant's black, face hidden beneath a leather mask. Alexander drove the figure backward, but the floor was slick with cold dust, and the attacker slipped through a side door before he could finish the strike. Alexander cut Lucas free. The boy opened his eyes weakly. "Emily, I'm here." She dropped beside him, though the movement nearly pulled her into darkness. She pressed a damp piece of her sleeve over his mouth and nose. "Breathe through this." Alexander lifted his son. From the corridor came the sound of running footsteps. The masked attacker had not escaped. They were circling back. Emily looked toward the furnace. A line of spilled oil ran beneath the door. "They're going to burn the tower." Alexander's expression changed. He carried Lucas toward the passage while Emily reached for the iron lever beside the furnace. It controlled the old service hatch leading into the outer courtyard. The lever would not move. She pulled again. Pain flashed white across her vision. Then Alexander's hand closed over hers. Together, they forced it down. The hatch opened. Cold night air tore through the room, dragging smoke outward. They emerged into the courtyard as flames climbed the tower wall behind them. A figure ran across the battlements. Alexander handed Lucas to a guard and gave chase. Emily followed as far as the stairs before her knees failed. Above, Alexander caught the attacker near the parapet. The mask was torn away. Long golden hair spilled into the firelight. Lady Victoria stared back at him. She was smiling. "You still do not understand," she said. "Daniel was never giving the orders." Then she looked past Alexander, directly at Emily. "The man who wants your son dead is already sitting on your council." Lady Victoria did not survive the fall. She stepped backward before Alexander could reach her, one heel finding empty air beyond the parapet. For a moment, her face lost its smile. Then the darkness took her. By dawn, Daniel Cross was in chains. He had been found near the eastern gate with blood on his sleeve and the blue glass fragment hidden inside his glove. But even after the guards dragged him into the council chamber, Emily knew the truth was not complete. Daniel had removed the evidence. Victoria had carried the blade. Neither of them had designed the trap. The answer came from the iron pin. It lay on the table before her, blackened by smoke, one end carved with a symbol so small most men dismissed it as a craftsman's mark. Emily did not. She had seen it before. Not in the castle. In her father's notebook. The memory returned with painful clarity. Rough pages spread across a kitchen table, her father's hands stained with oil and blue pigment, his finger tracing the same hooked line beside drawings of window braces, tower vents, and hidden locks. He had been a glazier. A good one. Good enough to notice when iron supports had been weakened on purpose. Good enough to ask questions that powerful men wanted buried. He died when Emily was 12. The official record called it a workshop accident. She had believed that because children often believe the version of grief adults give them. Now she understood. Alexander stood beside her at the council table. Lucas sat near the hearth under guard, wrapped in a wool blanket, alive but silent. Across from them, Lord Richard Hale watched Emily with the expression of a man observing an insect crawl across clean linen. Richard was Daniel's father. He had served 3 kings. He had advised Alexander through war, famine, and coronation. His name appeared on every repair order issued after Emily's father died. Emily placed the notebook beside the iron pin. "The same mark is here," she said. Richard did not look down. "A servant's drawing proves nothing." "It is not a servant's drawing." Her voice did not rise. "It is a record of every support my father found altered inside this castle." Alexander opened the notebook. Page after page showed weakened hinges, replaced bolts, blocked vents, and access routes leading toward royal chambers. All approved under Richard Hale's seal. Daniel began to shake. Richard remained still. Emily turned another page. There, beside a drawing of the Eastern Tower, her father had written one sentence. "If the heir dies, the king will blame the southern Pax." Alexander read it twice. The room became very quiet. Emily saw the plan then, not as separate attacks, but as a single shape. Kill Lucas. Drive Alexander into grief. Use the assassination to begin a war. Place Victoria beside the throne. Control the next heir through blood and marriage. Richard had not wanted one death. He had wanted a kingdom weakened enough to rule from behind it. "You murdered my father," Emily said. Richard finally looked at her. He was a tradesman who forgot the value of silence. Alexander's hand closed around the edge of the table. The wood cracked beneath his fingers. Richard smiled faintly. "And you," he said to Emily, "are only a waitress who made the same mistake." Emily met his eyes. "No." She placed the blue glass beside her father's notebook. "I am the mistake you failed to kill." The judgment was given before the entire court. By noon, every noble, guard, servant, and visiting alpha had been summoned back into the great hall. The broken window had been covered with black cloth, but pieces of colored glass still glittered between the stones. Emily stood beneath them. Her back was wrapped beneath a plain gray dress. Each breath pulled against the stitches, yet she refused the chair the healer had placed behind her. Across the hall, Lord Richard Hale knelt in chains. Daniel knelt beside him. No one looked at the beta as they once had. Authority had left him with the cloak and sword taken from his shoulders. Without them, he seemed smaller. Richard did not. Even in chains, he held his head high. "You would condemn a council lord," he said, "on the word of a waitress?" The insult moved through the hall like a familiar wind. Emily had heard versions of it her entire life. Only a servant. Only a girl carrying plates. Only someone whose silence was more valuable than her truth. Alexander rose from the throne. He wore no crown. He did not need one. The room straightened around him. "This waitress saw the danger your guards ignored," he said. "She warned the men you corrupted. She covered my son with her body while the rest of this court watched the glass fall." Richard's mouth tightened. Alexander descended the steps. "She entered a burning tower while wounded. She found the passage your soldiers did not know existed. She placed the proof of your treason before this council." He stopped in front of Richard. The waitress you mocked is the reason your future king is alive. No one spoke after that. Daniel confessed before sunset. He named the guards Richard had purchased, the craftsmen forced to alter the window, and the messengers who had carried false reports toward the southern territories. Each name was written down. Each door was closed. Each traitor was taken away. Richard received no public execution. Alexander chose something colder. His title was stripped. His lands returned to the crown. His name was removed from the council records, and he was sent to the northern prison where no banners flew and no one cared who his father had been. When the chains disappeared through the oak doors, Alexander turned toward Emily. She lowered her eyes by instinct. "Look at me," he said. The words were not harsh. That made obeying them more difficult. Emily raised her face. Before the assembled packs, Alexander removed the silver protection clasp from his cloak. It bore the Blackwood wolf beneath a crown. He fastened it at her shoulder. "From this moment, Emily Carter speaks before my council with the authority of a royal witness." A murmur passed through the nobles. "She will oversee the safety of Prince Lucas." The murmur grew louder. Alexander's gaze moved across the hall. "And any hand raised against her will be treated as a hand raised against my house." The silence that followed was absolute. Emily looked toward Lucas. He stood beside the throne in a dark blue coat, one hand still bandaged. He smiled at her with the uncertain relief of a child beginning to believe that danger had finally ended. Weeks later, the great hall opened again. The window above the royal table had been repaired. Emily entered carrying no tray. Several servants still moved instinctively to make room for her, unsure whether she belonged beside them or among the nobles. She was unsure too. A chair had been placed beside Lucas. Emily stopped behind it. Old habits told her to remain standing. Lucas pulled the chair outward. "This one is yours." Emily looked toward Alexander. He sat on the other side of his son, dressed in black, broad shoulders outlined by the morning light. His expression remained controlled, but something quieter had entered his eyes. "You do not serve from the shadows anymore," he said. Emily sat. Above them, sunlight passed through the new stained glass. The silver wolf remained. So did the crown. But beneath them, where blue glass had once stood empty, the craftsman had added another figure. A young woman with no title and no weapon stood over a child, her body turned toward the falling shards. Emily stared at it. Lucas leaned closer. "I told them what to make." Around them, the court began to rise. Not for the king. For her. Emily had not been born noble. No prophecy had chosen her. She had simply seen what others refused to see, acted when others remained still, and paid for that courage with her own blood. And now, in the place where she had once learned to disappear, the entire kingdom knew her name. The first time Alexander asked Emily to walk with him, no one called it courtship. He found her at dawn in the eastern courtyard, studying the new iron braces beneath the repaired windows. Frost silvered the stones. The castle was still quiet, its corridors not yet filled with servants, guards, and men who believed every morning existed for their convenience. Emily heard his boots behind her. She no longer lowered her eyes. That change was small enough that most people would not have noticed it. Alexander did. "You are inspecting the glass," he said. "I am inspecting the men who inspected the glass." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but she had learned that the king gave away very little without meaning to. "You trust no one." "I trusted Beta Cross." "So did I." The words settled between them. Alexander came to stand beside her. Without the throne, the council, or the black wolfskin cloak, he seemed less distant but no less powerful. He wore a dark wool tunic fitted across his broad shoulders, a sword at his side, and the expression of a man who had spent most of his life preparing for betrayal. Emily understood that expression now. Her wounds had closed, though thin scars remained across her back. Some nights, she still woke hearing glass strike stone. On those nights, she reminded herself of what had existed beneath her body. Lucas breathing. Lucas alive. "He asks for you every morning," Alexander said. "He asks for honey bread. He asks for both." They began walking. No guards followed closely, though Emily knew they watched from the battlements. The king had learned caution. She had taught him that without intending to. At the courtyard's edge, Lucas waited beside a young gray horse. His boots were muddy, his coat unfastened, and his hair resisted every attempt at royal order. "You are late," he announced. Emily looked at the rising sun. It is barely dawn. I have been awake for hours. Alexander examined the mud on his son's knees. That is not the defense you believe it is. Lucas ignored him and held out a folded sheet of parchment to Emily. It was a drawing. 3 figures stood beneath a badly shaped silver wolf. One was very tall. One carried a wooden sword. The third wore the Blackwood clasp at her shoulder. Emily studied it carefully. Who is this? Lucas pointed to the tall figure. Father. The angry eyebrows are accurate. Alexander looked down at her. This time, the smile appeared fully. It changed his face more than she expected. Lucas pointed to himself, then to Emily. And that is us. Emily's throat tightened. Not because of the drawing. Because the figures were holding hands. Alexander saw it too. He did not look away. There had been no prophecy between them. No sudden claim. No bond that erased fear, rank, or the distance built by years of living in different worlds. There had only been choices. He had chosen to believe her. She had chosen to remain. And each morning since, they had chosen again. Alexander extended his hand, not as a king summoning a servant, as a man asking a woman to walk beside him. Emily placed her hand in his. Lucas took the other. Together, they crossed the courtyard beneath windows that no longer hid a threat. High above them, the repaired glass caught the morning light. The woman beneath the silver wolf was no longer standing alone. The proposal did not happen beneath banners. There were no witnesses. No council waiting to approve it. No musicians hidden behind pillars. No silver tray carrying a ring shaped for spectacle. It happened in the old glass workshop. Emily had avoided the room for years. The door stood at the end of a narrow corridor beneath the western tower, warped by damp and marked with the faded outline of her father's name. Alexander had ordered it opened after Richard Hale's records were destroyed. Inside, dust covered the work tables. Tools hung where her father had left them. Small bottles of blue, red, and gold pigment stood along the shelves, their contents hardened by time. Emily entered alone. She touched the edge of the nearest table. For a moment, she was 12 again, watching her father bend over sheets of colored glass while evening light turned his hands blue. You came. Alexander's voice reached her from the doorway. Emily did not turn immediately. You knew I would. I hoped. He entered without his sword. That unsettled her more than the weapon ever had. The Alpha King crossed the room slowly, careful not to disturb the fragments scattered beneath the tables. In one hand, he carried a small wooden box. Emily looked at it. No ceremony. I have had enough ceremonies arranged by people who wanted something from me. And what do you want? He stopped in front of her. The question should have been easy for a king. It was not. Alexander had commanded armies without hesitation. He had condemned traitors while an entire court watched. Yet now, standing before one woman in a forgotten workshop, he seemed to search for words that power could not provide. You, he said at last. Emily's breath caught. Not because you saved Lucas. His voice remained low. Not because the court respects you. Not because my son already thinks of you as family. He opened the box. Inside lay no jeweled crown. Only a simple silver ring set with one piece of blue glass. The missing fragment from the old window. It had been cleaned, reshaped, and held between 2 narrow bands engraved with the Blackwood wolf. I kept it, Alexander said. After the trial, Emily stared at the blue surface. Once, it had been evidence of a murder. Now it caught the morning light and returned it gently. I do not know how to offer you a life untouched by danger, he continued. That would be a lie. Emily lifted her eyes. I do not need a safe lie. I know. A faint sadness touched his expression. That is one of the reasons I love you. The words were quiet. No thunder answered them. No ancient bond awakened. Only the old workshop, the smell of dust and iron, and the truth spoken without protection. Emily looked at the ring, then at him. Lucas will be furious that you asked without him. He helped choose the glass. That sounds like him. Alexander's mouth curved. Emily held out her hand. He did not move at first. A king could command obedience. But this was not obedience. This was consent. This was trust offered freely. Alexander placed the ring on her finger. From the corridor came a poorly concealed gasp. Lucas stepped into the doorway, followed by 3 guards pretending they had not been listening. I told you she would say yes, he announced. Emily laughed. The sound filled the room where her father's warnings had once been silenced. Alexander took her hand. Lucas took the other. And beneath the unfinished windows, surrounded by broken glass that no longer frightened her, Emily Carter chose the family she had already saved. The crown was heavier than Emily expected, not because of the silver, because of the silence beneath it. Hundreds of people filled the great hall, yet no one spoke as she stood at the foot of the throne. Nobles in velvet and fur lined the long tables. Warriors stood beneath black and silver banners. Servants gathered near the walls, occupying the same narrow spaces where Emily had once learned to become invisible. She saw Mrs. Hawthorne among them. The steward's keys still hung from her belt, but her eyes were lowered now, not in dismissal, in respect. Alexander waited on the raised platform. He wore the ceremonial armor of House Blackwood, dark steel fitted across his broad frame, a wolfskin mantle resting over his shoulders. The crown upon his head was iron and silver, severe rather than beautiful. Lucas stood beside him. The boy had insisted on carrying Emily's new cloak. It was too large for him. The black fabric dragged slightly behind his boots, and the silver embroidery twisted beneath his small hands. He refused every offer of assistance. Emily walked toward them alone. Each step echoed across the stone. She wore no crimson velvet, no gown designed to make her resemble the women who had occupied royal portraits before her. Her dress was pale blue, simple in shape, with long sleeves and a high collar that left the silver scars across her back hidden but not forgotten. At her shoulder rested the Blackwood protection clasp. At her fingers shone the blue glass ring, the same color that had once fallen toward Lucas like a blade. The high priest raised his hands. "Emily Carter," he began, before the assembled Pax, "do you accept the crown, the house, and the bloodline placed beneath your protection?" Emily looked at Lucas. He was trying very hard not to smile. Then she looked at Alexander. The Alpha King did not appear uncertain often. He had faced armies with less tension in his shoulders. But this was not a battlefield. He could not command her answer. That mattered to both of them. "I accept the responsibility," Emily said. The priest paused. It was not the traditional response. A murmur moved through the hall. Emily continued, "But I will not accept silence." The murmur stopped. She turned toward the council tables. "No servant will be punished for reporting danger. No craftsman will lose his life because a lord finds the truth inconvenient. No child will be told that rank matters more than safety." Her gaze moved to the servants along the wall. "I know what it is to see something wrong and be ordered to look away." Alexander descended from the throne. He stopped beside her. "And from this day," he said, his voice carrying through the hall, "no one in Blackwood Keep will give that order again." The room changed. Emily felt it move through the servants first. A head lifting, a pair of shoulders straightening, a young waitress near the western pillar looking directly toward the throne instead of the floor. The priest placed the silver crown in Alexander's hands. He lifted it over Emily's head. Before he lowered it, he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "This does not make you worthy." Emily met his eyes. "No, you were worthy when no one knew your name." Then he placed the crown upon her. The hall erupted, not with polite applause, with the sound of hundreds rising at once. Lucas abandoned the cloak and threw his arms around Emily's waist. She laughed and bent to hold him, nearly losing the crown in the process. Alexander caught it with one hand. "The first royal crisis of your reign," he said. "I handled the last one better." His smile came slowly. "So you did." That evening, after the feast ended and the candles burned low, Emily returned to the repaired window above the royal table. The woman in the glass still stood over the child. But the image had changed. A second figure now stood beside her. Tall, broad-shouldered, one hand holding a sword, the other reaching toward hers. Emily heard Alexander approach. "You added yourself," she said. "Lucas added me. He made you too tall. He claims it is accurate." Lucas appeared between them, wrapped in a blanket and carrying 3 pieces of honey bread. "One for each of us," he said. They sat together beneath the window. A king, a queen who had once carried trays, and the boy who had brought them together beneath falling glass. Outside, winter settled over Blackwood Keep. Inside, no one stood in the shadows. And when the morning light finally passed through the blue glass, it did not fall like a weapon. It covered them like a promise. The first warning came from a kitchen girl. Her name was Nora Bell. She was 16, newly hired, and still walked through Blackwood Keep as though every corridor might accuse her of being somewhere she did not belong. She carried trays with both hands. She apologized when others stepped into her path. She lowered her eyes before anyone asked. Emily recognized the habit immediately. Once, it had been her own. Nora found the queen in the lower courtyard at sunrise, inspecting the new storage doors with the master carpenter. She stopped 10 feet away and remained there, pale and trembling, until Emily noticed her. "What is it?" The girl glanced toward the guards. One of them began to speak. Emily raised a hand, not to silence Nora, to silence everyone else. The courtyard became still. Nora swallowed. "There is something wrong with the grain room, Your Majesty." The title made her voice shake harder. Emily stepped closer. "What did you see?" "The sacks nearest the western wall are wet underneath, but the roof does not leak." Nora twisted her apron between her fingers. "And there is a sweet smell. Not grain. Something else." The master carpenter frowned. "It is probably spoiled barley." Nora shrank at once. Emily saw it happen, the shoulders folding inward, the apology already forming. "What kind of sweet smell?" Emily asked. Nora looked up. "Like crushed flowers. But bitter." Emily's expression changed. So did Alexander's when she told him. By noon, the grain room had been sealed. The royal healer found poison soaked into the lower sacks, enough to kill hundreds once the grain was milled and distributed through the winter villages. The investigation uncovered 3 merchants bribed by a southern lord who believed famine would weaken Blackwood rule. No one died, because a kitchen girl had noticed damp cloth and an unfamiliar smell. That evening, the court assembled. Nora stood beneath the repaired stained glass window, shaking so badly that Emily could hear the small silver buttons on her dress tap against one another. The nobles expected a reward of coin. Alexander gave her that. Emily gave her something else. "A place in the royal household," she announced, "as an inspector of kitchens and stores." Surprise moved through the hall. Nora stared at her. "I am only a kitchen girl." Emily descended the steps. The crown no longer felt heavy on her head. Not because it weighed less, but because she had learned that authority became lighter when used to lift someone else. "I was only a waitress," she said. Across the hall, Lucas smiled. He was older now, taller, though not yet as tall as his father. The scar on his palm had faded to a thin white line. He still preferred wooden bowls to silver ones, and honey bread remained the quickest way to improve his mood. Alexander stood beside him, broad and watchful, the years adding silver at his temples without diminishing the force of his presence. Nora lifted her eyes. For the first time, she did not look afraid to be seen. Later, Emily stood beneath the window with Alexander. Sunset passed through the colored glass, laying blue light across the stone. "The kingdom is changing," he said. Emily watched Nora cross the hall without lowering her head. "No," she replied. "It is learning to listen." Alexander took her hand. Above them, the woman in the glass still shielded the child from falling shards. But below that image, newly added in a narrow band of silver, were the words Lucas had chosen for the hall. She saw what others ignored. Emily read them once. Then she looked across the room at the servants, craftsmen, guards, and children who no longer needed permission to speak the truth. The glass had shattered only once. The silence had shattered forever.